Thank you very much for coming on the program today, Alex.
So, well, pleasure to be here.
It's been great connecting with you and seeing some of your work. And primarily, I came across some writing you did about Indonesia and its step towards BRICS. It'd be really good to have a bit of a chat about the changing nature of Southeast Asia and where Australia might lie within that. Just firstly, a little bit about yourself, what you do, where you work, and what your work aims to achieve.
Great, great. Yeah. So, a little bit about me. So, I'm a lecturer at RMIT in the School of Global Urban and Social Studies. I currently lecture in two subjects, one called Economic Ideas and the Environment, and another one called Policy in Practice. And so, those are both subjects that are tailored for students in the Bachelor of Environment and Society and the Bachelor of Urban and Regional Planning. And so, that's currently what I lecture in, but I've taught at RMIT for about 10 years in a long sort of list of different subjects and areas. A lot of them in the business school. So things like political economy of global business is a subject I've taught for a long time. Work in global society, so like labor economics and those sorts of things. And I did my PhD about 10 years ago now. I finished in 2020, and so that was about social movements in the wake of the global financial crisis of 2008, and how they institutionalize over the long term and evolve from these very chaotic masses of crowds and sort of disorganized sort of political action into more formalized institutions. So things like NGOs, political parties, citizen sort of participatory democratic platforms, also things like nonprofits, charities, and so on. And I
Mhm.
was trying to understand which of these forms of institutionalization actually produces political impact in the long term. Yeah, and so what I sort of did is compared a couple of different social movements. The climate justice movement here in Australia was one of my case studies. I also looked at the Black Lives Matter movement over in the San Francisco Bay Area in the United States, and also did fieldwork in Spain, in Barcelona, during an election in 2015 and 2016. That was about a social movement called Podemos, which is one of the main political parties over there now, part of the coalition of the governing Social Democratic Party in Spain. And so, what I sort of found in that thesis was that it's becoming very hard for social movements to create political change. Yeah, and it's by design, I think, in a lot of respects, that the tactics that social movements used of street protest, which did achieve significant sort of forms of political impact not too long ago in the 20th century, seem to no longer be as effective. Yeah, and so in terms of trying to bring about the goal of climate justice or the goal of like I don't know, in the case of the Podemos party, like, getting rid of like fiscal austerity and creating a more participatory form of democratic governance. Yeah, these are sort of very lofty goals, right? And it's very hard to realize those goals. And so the thesis was basically about, yeah, how do you create change? Yeah, and so that's sort of what I studied in that. Um, and I think if you look at lots of social movements today, you see these mass mobilizations of millions and millions of people in the streets that don't necessarily translate into significant structural or systemic change. Yeah, and so a lot of the time, the Black Lives Matter movement is kind of a classic case study of this. Um, there are, literally tens of millions of people that at the time, the ones during the pandemic, those are the biggest street protests in U.S. history, right? And it was very culturally impactful for a time. But if that doesn't translate into institutional transformation and political change and structures changing, then the movement pretty quickly sort of dissipates, right? And so people get burnt out with street protests. People get tired of mobilizing every day in the streets. And so that is very much sort of what happens if there isn't an attempt to sort of, yeah, evolve from that grassroots level of political action into more formal political change. And so that's kind of what I was looking at in my PhD. And then, yeah, more recently, to talk about that article you mentioned before about Indonesia joining BRICS. In the last couple of years, I've sort of shifted my research interests towards geopolitics in lots of different ways. A part of this is because maybe if change doesn't come from street protest? Where does it come from? I think geopolitics is sort of, in some ways, maybe a scary subject for a lot of people because of the dangers associated with conflict between particularly the great power states. But um, in a lot of ways, I hold a lot of hope from geopolitics. I hold on to a lot of silver linings about the possibilities for change that will benefit the big majority of the world's population, yeah, through potential transformations in the international sort of order. And so the article on Indonesia joining BRICS is very much a contribution in that space, where Indonesia is a really fascinating country for anyone who hasn't looked into it before. I read a book by a guy named Vincent Bevins called The Jakarta Method about 5 years ago. Have you come across that one?
I've come across it, but I haven't read it myself. But yeah, it's a very popular
Comes up
title
a
in the circle. Yeah, I've heard it a lot.
It comes up a lot in geopolitics. So I highly recommend reading it. So that was a really transformative experience for me, reading that text and just becoming aware of the fact that Indonesia was arguably this really pivotal uh, phase in the Cold War. Yeah, and so Bevins argues that it's more significant than Vietnam, actually, at determining the course of the Cold War. It's more significant than, I don't know, events in Eastern Europe or Central Asia or elsewhere.
And
Um,
Suharto's reign was more significant as well as a consequence, right?
yeah, of course. And so, like the fact that Suharto, a guy who governed Indonesia for 31 years, by the time he he um, he was out of power in '97. Yeah, he was a very loyal U.S. Sort of comprador elite. Yeah, and so the regime that was set up in the wake of the coup that overthrew Sukarno was extremely loyal to the West broadly and the US particularly. But Bevan sort of argues that the Jakarta method, which is essentially a way of the US and like-minded states um, infiltrating the senior ranks of the military in a country and offering bribes and privileges and perks like sending their kids to elite US universities, for example,
Hmm.
to sort of win them over and buy their loyalty. And then at the sort of strategically advantageous moment, have those senior officers in the military of the country align with other sympathetic political forces, particularly, say, populist movements or far right political forces in the country, and use those sort of collective forces to overthrow the government at the sort of opportune moment. And that's kind of what happened in Jakarta in 1963 to 65. And so there was a very significant sort of innovation in that coup, where effectively, I think estimates vary, but it's between 1 and 3 million people who were communists or people accused of being communists by
Or Chinese, right?
yeah,
Yep.
as well. That's a good point. Um, and yeah, so they were sort of called in, for innocent sounding interviews at the local police office, and they were just disappeared and killed one by one. And so that method actually was very effective at stopping the spread of communism in Indonesia. And for that reason, it was exported all over the world, and particularly across Latin America. It was, the Jakarta method was something that they talk about having been applied in country after country in particularly Latin America. So this is the context to understand politics in Indonesia. The fact that it was um, the third biggest communist party in the world at the height of the Cold War, by the way, but before the coup. It was after the Soviet Union and China. It was poised to become under Sukarno's leadership, and this very significant conference called the Bandung Conference in 1955, which sort of brought together all of the sort of post-colonial movements and leaders of countries from across Asia and Africa. Um, and they launched this thing called the non-aligned movement. And so basically, for from that moment on, Indonesia was a massive target for regime change from the sort of Western perspective. And you can imagine.
Just like Yugoslavia was as well. I mean, anyone that joined that non-aligned movement was automatically a target, right?
That's right.
And look, just the pandemonium around that time, that coup there, and as you said, like one of the largest communist parties, like on the planet, really,
Mm.
and also it had very Indonesian characteristics as well. Like it was quite a native movement, wasn't it?
That's a great observation too. So, this is a part of what I think was particularly threatening about Sukarno from the US perspective. The fact that it was, you could call it like socialism with Indonesian characteristics is sort
Yeah.
of maybe an application of the Chinese phrase to the Indonesian one. It sort of combined the sort of religious pluralism of Indonesian society at that time. So there's obviously a significant Muslim population and significant indigenous religions. And so Sukarno's ideology was sort of a synthesis of lots of different, you know, cultural features of the Indonesian national context
Mm.
that are particular to them. That combine that with ideas like Marxism and socialism and so on. There's lots to be sort of said about well, what the world might have looked like if that government had not been overthrown, and
What Australia might have looked like.
you can imagine a very different sort of geopolitical sort of course of development, basically, if that event had not taken place. And so, yeah, just reading that book, The Jakarta Method, sort of makes you look at the Cold War in a fundamentally different light.
Mm.
It makes you look at our current international order in a very different light as well. And so that's kind of the context that shapes the article that we were working on. Myself and a colleague from Melbourne Uni, Jessica Petrono, and that's coming out in an academic journal called Third World Quarterly. Um, so that was an article that we wrote about Indonesia joining the BRICS group of nations. So I think your viewers are probably well appraised to what BRICS is.
It would be really good for you to break down BRICS a little bit here. We will pivot into multipolarism at some point, but it'd be really good for you to, yeah, kind of break down what BRICS is, please.
BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Those are the five original founding members of the group. It's a group of countries from across the global south who share a set of common grievances and common concerns about a lack of democracy in the international economic order. And so it's very different from traditional political or military blocs in the sense that it's really not like the Warsaw Pact or say NATO or other sort of or the EU, for example. It's not formal and it's not its decisions are not let's say completely binding on what the members agree to. It's more of a forum where countries that share these grievances come together and engage in negotiations around things that they can cooperate on. And so that makes it quite different from those groupings. Um, Arguably a little bit more democratic in some respects, in the
Mm.
sense that the members of the group can sort of decide whether they want to go ahead with different sort of courses of development.
Sorry to
They're
butt
not
in, Alex,
bound.
but is there any influence or inspiration that comes from? We always love to neglect it and knock it down, but is there a little bit of ASEAN influence on BRICS, the way the ASEAN consensus is driven? Is there a similar kind of method with BRICS at all, or?
Yeah, I think you could say that definitely. Yeah, there's a sense that they're not going to force an agenda like the dominant or like the bigger hegemonic sort of countries within a grouping are not going to try and belittle or belligerently pressure the smaller members to go along with what the bigger one wants. Yeah, this is kind of something that you do see again and again with BRICS. And so yeah, you have a very diverse membership, and as it's expanded, it's become more diverse, and that's made, I think, in some respects, it becomes very unpredictable how it's going to develop because the more diverse and the more members it takes on, the harder it's going to be to come to consensus
Mm.
as more voices are introduced. So that's going to be very interesting to watch. Basically, the article we wrote talks about BRICS expansion, and so there's five new members that have joined in the last year or two. And so those are Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Ethiopia, we have in Indonesia, of course, joining at the beginning of this year, and there's one more I'm forgetting. What was the other one? Um,
Argentina slipped in there and slipped out again, or
yeah, they did, but then they quit, didn't they, after Milei's election? I'm forgetting one more country. This is very silly of me, but yeah. So there's also a much longer list though of countries that have either already applied to join and their membership is under consideration, or that are informally expressing interest in joining. And so if you look
Mhm.
at the map in the article that we put together, it is pretty much the entire global south. Yeah, so it's pretty much the whole of Africa, the whole of Asia, the whole of Latin America. They're either or already discussing applying for membership, or their membership's being considered, or they're sort of considering whether to join or not. And so it's very interesting as a sort of site of you know uh, contestation of ideas and contestation of like different paths of development for countries in the global south. And so what's I think distinctive and special about BRICS is that despite all of those challenges that I mentioned before about the difficulty coming to consensus, its lack of formal decision making, and the fact that it's not binding and so on, which arguably undermines its efficacy to bring about material change in the world. Despite all those things, it's a very significant grouping because of the fact that it brings together these countries that have a common set of grievances. And so, what's happening is that historically speaking, when countries of the global south try to cooperate with each other, there are coups and there are attempts to, break up these groupings and undermine them, and those have continued, of course. So a big part of what we talk about in the article is the hostility towards BRICS expansion
Yes.
from particularly the US.
Yep.
And so Trump famously threatened BRICS with 100% tariffs. I think it was the beginning of this year or a bit earlier. And then he was interviewed in the media, and he said something like, "So BRICS is no longer a thing, basically." And as soon as they heard about the threat, they all gave up and surrendered, and so on. And that hasn't happened, of course. It's still very much a thing. They're meeting more than ever. There are all sorts of sort of different policy areas where the BRICS countries are cooperating, and the expansion of the number of members is far from the limit of BRICS expansion in all
And
those sort of.
sorry,
Yeah,
Alex. And also with BRICS itself,
mm,
and the perceived threat of BRICS in Washington.
mm.
How much of this is about de-dollarization, for example, and how much of this is about primacy?
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. That's a really great point as well. So it's very much about that, and that's one of the things that makes it so significant. Um, you could say, yeah, I was going to go back to before to clarify. So what brings those countries together is the fact that the international economic order is not democratic. Yeah, and so if you look at the voting share in institutions like the IMF for the different national members that make it up, the US has 4% of the world's population, but something like 15 or 20% of the votes in the IMF. Yeah,
Mhm.
India, by contrast, it's very much the reverse. So India has something like 18% of the world's population, but only 2.8% of the votes in the IMF. Yeah. And so if you're a country like India, you're looking at the institution of the IMF and you're thinking, this is not desirable. Yeah. This is not a fair representation of, our country's population as a share of the world. Yeah. And so in a democratic economic order, India would have a far greater say in sort of the agenda of the IMF. Yeah. And so what BRICS does is basically look at institutions like the IMF and say, okay, if you will not be reformed to be more democratic, what we're going to do is create new institutions that compete with you and that are more democratic by design. Yeah. And so that's very much what the New Development Bank is, for example. And there's a whole host of other sort of BRICS affiliated international institutions and platforms that are sort of trying to, make progress towards the same goal here, which is to democratize the international economic order and make it more representative of the global majority of the world's population, which is what BRICS represents. It's already something like 55% of the world's population in BRICS. I think it's 45% or so of world GDP. And so once you factor in, all of the other countries that are considering joining, it starts to become pretty clear. Like that's pretty much the whole world, except for this golden billion, yeah, in the sort of countries of the global north. Yeah.
And is it
Um,
and this is a parallel system that's kind of working independently on its own, and people are forging nations are forging ahead on BRICS. As much as the West likes to bluster and denigrate it and things like that, there is action and there are tracks being laid every day in this world, right? If you're enjoying this program and some of the guests that we're having on it, I would like to ask you to please help and support our channel by liking and subscribing or following us on your podcast platform, or even heading to boganintel.com where you can get my latest articles, these podcasts, and any discussions that we're having. Thank you very much.
yeah. So there's a story I was looking at just before this. BRICS at a crossroads, mutual recognition or Article 6. So this is in renewablematter.eu. So there's a lot of summits going on constantly. There's I was just trying to find the quote in the article I was looking for. I can't find it here, but yeah, there's a lot of momentum basically towards cooperation between these countries, and a lot of different institutions that they're setting up that are sort of gathering pace. And if you're looking at this from the global North's perspective, this is very concerning, yeah, because those are your economic colonies. Yeah, this is a huge part of the reason that the US dollar has its value in the world. Yeah, the reason that rich countries are rich and poor countries are poor. Yeah, it's because of this dynamic called unequal exchange. Yeah, where basically every year, I think it's $10.8 trillion of wealth, which is drained from the global south by the global north. Yeah, you would sort of hear that number and think, oh, that's a big scary number, but that's okay, right? Because we have all of this charity and all of this aid that we give back to them, and therefore that makes the exploitation okay. If you do the numbers though, and you look at the volume of all of the value of that charity and aid and so on that goes back from the global north to the global south, it's about 30 to 1 of ratio. Yeah, so we're taking the bakery and throwing back some crumbs and saying, aren't you grateful? Aren't you sort of happy that we're so generous and we give you so much in charity and aid and so on?
That's a bit
Um,
like a lobbyist. That's a lobbyist ratio, right? Like, how much does the Israeli lobby chip in as opposed to what they get back in military aid, right? That's about 30 to 1. That's a pretty good number.
yeah, things rhyme. What can I say? I don't know why how that came up. Yeah.
No,
Um,
but what you're saying here though, like, is that disparity has become more than just a grievance. It's become something that's been put into action, led by these the big five there in BRICS. And what is the approach of BRICS, of the hegemonic BRICS nations? I mean, like say China, for example. If you look at like Besant or Elbridge Colby, they would say that things like the SCO, for example, are China's way of, coercing the member nations into, essentially joining its umbrella and bowing to China. What's the difference between an SCO and a BRICS? For starters, moment they're meeting with the Saudis. They were in Kazakhstan a few weeks ago, trying to sort of drum up support there. So can you explain, yeah, how is the US dealing with this? Is it only reactive? Is it only these big blustery words?
Yeah, so I think it is a very reactive form of government at the moment in power in the United States. I think you list all of those countries and the efforts by the US to sort of flip their geopolitical alignment away from China, away from Russia, particularly one like Kazakhstan. Like it's such a funny one to sort of try and go in and get them to align with the US, given that they literally share like what is it, like probably a 2,000 mile long border with Russia that they're not going to anyway. But the difference between the SCO and BRICS is so BRICS is really an economic, informal forum where the countries that make it up are looking for ways to cooperate, looking for ways to get around things like economic sanctions. So the global sanctions regime currently applies to something like a third of the world's population. More than 30 countries are on the list of countries that are sanctioned by the United States. there's also a number of countries that are sanctioned by the UN, countries that are sanctioned by the EU, but it's primarily the United States that sort of has an impact in terms of this global sanctions regime. And so, if you're a country like Iran or Russia, or to a lesser extent China, you've been affected by U.S. sanctions, yeah, on your industry, your technology, maybe your energy sector, and so on. These are very primary sort of sectors to run an economy. Yeah, and the intention of the sanctions regime is to disrupt the ability of an economy to function to the extent that the people become so angry with the government that they overthrow them, and then there's a window of opportunity where the US can go in and flip the geopolitical alignment of that country back to the US camp. Yeah, this is very much what they're trying to do in all of those countries that you were talking about before. The maximum pressure campaign on Venezuela at the moment,
Yeah.
and this is sort of like I think largely being driven. So it's interesting what you were saying before about like how reactive the sort of geopolitical strategy of the US is at the moment. I think there are factions within the government that do have an agenda, and so like there's the Miami Cubans that are sort of like obviously angling for regime change in Venezuela, but also Nicaragua and Cuba and lots of other countries on the hit list of Latin American countries that are not geopolitically aligning with the US as much as they would like them to. And so therefore, yeah, they've been famously, Cuba has been under blockade for like 60 years. That's probably the most extreme example. And so, that sanction regime matters because historically speaking, it has worked. Yeah, it's been a very powerful tool with which to discipline countries that are not towing the line geopolitically or economically with what the hegemon, the US says. And so they're very accustomed to, yeah, making demands and disciplining countries and getting what they want. They're very unaccustomed to countries that have been sanctioned and that they've tried to discipline Iran and Russia and all these other countries that are members of the BRICS group. They're very unaccustomed to those sanctions attempts and those regime change attempts not working. Yeah, and so this is what's special about BRICS, is that it enables all these countries to sort of pool their resources and set up new international trading sort of systems that enable them to overcome the global sanctions regime and make their economies more resilient, make them able to withstand the pressure campaigns. And so Venezuela at the moment is a very interesting country in relation to BRICS, in that is very funny. Earlier in the year that they applied to join, and they've made a big sort of song and dance about how they're very enthusiastic about joining the BRICS group for obvious reasons, given what we were just talking about. But Brazil apparently, under Lula's direction, vetoed Venezuela's membership because of the border skirmish in Guyana.
Mm.
What's it called? The Essequibo region of Guyana, where the oil is in that border province on Venezuela that was historically part of Venezuela's territory before. And so there's been an attempt to annex this largely unpopulated but very resource-rich region.
Mhm.
So Brazil didn't like the fact that Venezuela did that, and therefore vetoed their application to become members of BRICS. And as a result of that, Venezuela is not in it. And then
And incredibly isolated now as a consequence.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so you could argue that maybe if they had been able to join earlier, the way the US would be looking at it would be quite different. Yeah, because they might fear the blowback in the case of attacking a member of BRICS being well, potentially more significant. Yeah, than a situation where they appear quite isolated, which they do at the moment.
Look, I would like to take you back into Indonesia a little bit here to, what we're seeing with Indonesia, Myanmar, Vietnam, all these nations stepping up for BRICS.
Hmm.
Is a bit of a Southeast Asian contingent, right? Will there be blocks emerging within the bloc itself? Do you think? Will there be maybe a Southeast Asian consensus-driven bloc that emerges in BRICS? Via this obvious movement.
Yeah, I think it would make sense for them to cohere their collective sort of interests and to have some attempts at unity within the grouping. And because of the diversity of BRICS' membership, again, it's going to be maybe 5 or 6 or 7 billion people in this group of countries eventually. If all those countries that are expressing interest in it do end up joining. So that's an incredible amount of voices, yeah, that are trying to speak at the same time, and they might be saying quite different things, yeah, because the political forces in each of those member states is obviously very, very different. You know, the contrast between just India and China, or just China and Russia alone, in terms of the political sort of movements in those countries that are prevailing in their political system, it's huge. There's a huge, huge disparity. Yeah, and so despite that, there is still the possibility for them to cooperate on certain issues. Yeah, and so that this is very much the way I would look at ASEAN and BRICS, and the potential for like a Southeast Asian faction or bloc within the bloc. Yeah, although I would hesitate to talk about blocks in this context, because that sort of implies. It's a repeat of the Cold War or something, and it's very much something they're trying to avoid doing. Although this is sort of part of what we were talking about in the article, is that despite that intention, how this is being perceived by the global North is very much that it is going to be like the Cold War, and it's going to be a block, and it's
That's
going to
right.
be
The
a very
2.0.
direct.
The
Yeah,
2.0 has been said by many people. And like one of the things that I'm sort of picking up on too is like BRICS seems to be creating a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel for a lot of these nations. So, you can weather the storm, you can cop the sanctions or the SWIFT. SWIFT is a big anvil they're dropping at the moment as well. And, they're threatening BRICS with that. With that all the time, but I mean, it seems like there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and a touch one, touch all sort of thing that allows these countries to maybe put the blinkers on and get through this tough period over the next few years to kind of end up in the greener pastures on the other side. Is there something to that?
yeah, absolutely. So this is why it's so threatening from the global North's perspective, that
Yep.
there are these countries across the global South that are engaging in cooperation, setting up new platforms and new mechanisms for conducting trade. And yeah, the fact that it's such a significant share of the world's population, and such a significant grouping of countries already, that's going to snowball into more countries being a part of it. Every one of those is taking away sources of revenue, sources of labor power, sources of raw materials, and so on, that the US will no longer have access to. Yeah, that the global North will no longer have access to. And so there's a huge rush at the moment to try and destabilize and disrupt that cooperation, and prevent the formation or the evolution of these global South-South cooperation platforms into something that is more formalized, and that is therefore more able to exert material change in the world, and sort of bring about a reduction in global inequality, and a more egalitarian sort of development order.
And this is coinciding with the decline in US primacy and power projection. We're seeing the re-emergence of the Monroe Doctrine in this 2.0 kind of style. And, personally, I just feel like as America fails, as the US fails more in its global endeavors, it's going to take out that frustration on its region a little bit more. And that's a really unfortunate thing for some of those nations around. And with Asia itself, that disruptive force has been spoken about in Washington, this Cold War confrontation. There was a political uprising that sort of happened in Indonesia about a month ago. Is this part of it? Can we see these color revolution? We saw in Bangladesh. Something happened. We saw in Nepal something happen. Are we going to see the CIA flexing its muscles in Southeast Asia, in a way that we haven't seen in a long time?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly going to be something that they try to do. Obviously within the US's, rational sort of geopolitical interest to try and flip the alignment of a country that's not geopolitically aligned with them at the moment. Yeah, absolutely. There's going to be a continued sort of drive to have these color revolutions, and to get them back in the camp of countries that are loyal to the US, and that are providing their raw materials, the labor resources of their economy for US benefit. Yeah, that's going to be something that doesn't go away, obviously. Um, you mentioned before about the Monroe Doctrine. There's a very interesting discussion happening at the moment on Twitter about whether the US is retreating from its confrontation with China.
Mm.
So I think you could look at this in a couple of different ways. I think it would make sense that they would want to have this Monroe Doctrine 2.0 as a sort of tactical retreat from great power confrontation with Russia and China, in the sense that given the failure of the US strategy in the tariff war, and the fact that you can sort of tell from the body language between Xi and Trump, can't you, who's the sort of winner in those negotiations? You can sort of tell. Yeah, the US attempt to pressure the great power states is no longer working. And so, as a tactical sort of retreat to the backyard, as they call it, it would make sense for them to try and sort of put on a show of force and sort of discipline Venezuela, discipline Nicaragua, discipline Cuba, potentially with regime change wars, because that's much easier, right, than going toe to toe with China or Russia or more likely today, both of them at the same time. Which in all of the war
Yeah.
games that they've staged, the US loses. Yeah, and so they're very acutely aware of the fact that any war between the great power states very quickly evolves into a world war, which very quickly evolves into potential nuclear exchange, which is a lose lose scenario for everyone involved. And so, what do you do if you're a hegemon and you're trying to sort of hold on to that status, that privileged sort of position in the world order? You kind of can't go to war with the big dogs. Yeah, you've got to sort of pick on the smaller players in order to sort of be able to sort of put on that show of force and hold
And
on to your status.
And Alex, I worry a little bit about what you're saying there because in the Cold War there was there were some movers and shakers on both sides that knew how to play in that environment, and they wrote the rules, and they knew what they were. But there's just such a reactive nature going on in America. Like they're clutching at a shadow. They're jumping at shadows, and they're stabbing in the dark at things, and it makes you sort of wonder a little bit how they're going to be able to handle this transfer into multipolarism. I was speaking to another guest about this. Like, America had the opportunity to be front and center, to streamline itself, to sort of reduce its bases, and to actually be the leader of the multipolar world. It could have positioned itself to be a fighting fit multipolar power. But now it's been sort of holding on to primacy and this dream of holding the world for so long, whereas these other countries have been speaking in a different language for quite a while. And the further on this goes, the more catching up everyone has to do. And I think this applies even more so to Australia right now. I mean, like, we look at Indonesia, we like to say, hey, Indonesia is our closest, our most important relationship, and this, that, and the other. But we denigrate Great BRICS every 10 seconds, the group that they're in. We play down the importance of Indonesia, of its independent ambitions in the region, right? So, where does Australia sit when it follows these kind of sweet nothings, and actually does it's sitting like kind of adjacent to this incredible opportunity? And I would like to ask you, where does Australia sit in BRICS? Does it have a chance that it could ever join, or is it just such a taboo, under the US security umbrella, that we'll never be able to realize a future in the region?
I don't think there's anything stopping any country joining BRICS at some point in the future. It really does depend on like the political forces in that country and the relationship of that country to the global south and its struggle against neo-colonial order. Yeah, and so like if you're a country that has played a constructive role in challenging neo-colonial sort of international institutions and dynamics, it makes perfect sense for you to join BRICS right away, because that's what they're all trying to overcome. They're all trying to sort of, as I said before, create a more democratic international sort of trade regime and a development regime. They're trying to overcome, a centuries-long pattern of unequal exchange and uneven development. Um, they are that's what they're all trying to do. So for any country that's not already in it, and that has a shared grievance and a shared interest in overcoming those dynamics, it makes sense for them to join. So bringing it back to Australia, it becomes a little bit complicated for us there, doesn't it? Because we have a history of actually being on the wrong side of that equation, yeah, and having materially benefited from colonialism and from neo-colonial order. And so it wouldn't really make sense, I don't think, and I don't think any I'm not aware of any political party or leader in Australia that is talking about joining the BRICS group of countries. You can tell from that fact that it's very far from being on the agenda. Um,
There's not even independent out there just even mentioning it. It's quite strange, right?
yeah. It's strange and it's not so strange. It's strange in that we're living in a time of the ascendant sort of multipolar order is coming, and we can sort of see that wave coming. But we are part of the old unipolar order. Yeah, we are sort of an outpost of the American and formerly the British led sort of international order. And we have to probably let that go at some point in the next several decades. We have to sort of be aware that those trying to hold on to that, yeah, and there is kind of a zero sum competition there between a unipolar order and a multipolar order, yeah, where that competition, you can't have both at the same time. Yeah, you can't have a more democratic set of international institutions and this sort of highly undemocratic set of institutions. It's going to be one or the other. And so at the moment we are kind of sort of sitting in a very sort of what would you call it, like you know it's not a comfortable position, is it? But it's a position that we seem to be disinclined to adjust from. Yeah, and it seems like, yeah, it's difficult to shake people out of what they're accustomed to. But yeah, we can see from the urgency of what's happening in Europe at the moment, the way in which the US is trying to get Germany to become like the main country in charge of NATO now, and take over its war. It's security efforts more broadly on the continent. You can sort of imagine in the confrontation with China, which I don't believe is going away, by the way. I don't think that those people who are talking about the Monroe Doctrine 2.0 and so on are entirely correct in that. I think the long term goal is always for the US to have great power competition with Russia and China. They do want to sort of control the whole world, so that's not going to be a goal they just give up. Um, there might be a tactical retreat from that in the short term, but there's going to be a pivot back to that maybe after Venezuela or so on.
We're talking about, Australia's aspirations, within that BRICS framework, and how like there's a juxtaposition, I suppose, like with Australia being under this AUKUS scenario as well. I mean, we've got the former, one side we've got the former colonial power that had, its flag flying over Hong Kong during the Opium Wars, and the optics of just that, how we embrace them. We're doing freedom of navigation operations with the British in the South China Sea. And then on the other side, we have America, which is the enemy of BRICS and China's peer competitor. And I just think like it just feels like it sticks out a little bit when we have these fig leaf or olive branches. I don't know what they are. When we go over to Malaysia or Indonesia, and we talk like we're a part of this Southeast Asian community, but then we sit back and announce massive military arrangements with Washington, including nuclear submarines designed to be stored in Australia to attack targets in Asia one day. And I find it interesting that you say that, I feel the same way as you from what I can see. Like, yeah, there might be a pragmatic shift to like streamline the US footprint. But at some point, it's going to get upset and come back to the table because China's going to keep expanding and Russia and China are going to keep making grounds under their new arrangement, and it won't be able to keep its hands out. So is Australia destined? Like, I mean, could you see the US punishing Western nations that dare consider joining BRICS? I mean, we saw with the Netherlands, for example, their semiconductor arrangement with Nexperia. I don't know if you read about that at all, but like how they changed that arrangement pretty quick, and they've done a backflip on it. Could we see a similar kind of thing happening in Australia every time we tentatively walk out in the national interest to cut some deal around this BRICS environment? We might be getting cudgeled on top of the head, is there a chance of that sort of being the state of play?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the yeah this is the awkward sort of foreign policy decision that Australian governments are forced to make in the context of the sort of shift from unipolarity to multipolarity, um, and in the context of great power competition between the US and China in particular. Yeah, we have to choose between our biggest trading partner and our major defense partner. Yeah, and the last guy that tried it properly, it didn't end very well for him. And so
No.
ever since Whitlam, the Whitlam dismissal, there's been just, one prime minister after another absolutely terrified that if they say anything at all that is going to be perceived as hostile to the Americans, they're going to get couped. And so therefore, pretty much every leader since Whitlam has been extremely sort of skewed towards the US side of that
Mm.
equation, wanting to toe the line and not do anything that upsets them. But you can see from countries like the Netherlands and other various US vassals around the world, um, that has costs ultimately. Yeah, towing the line, and it's a question of like, well, how impactful do those costs have to get before the political debate about geopolitically realigning ourselves away from the US is able to sort of, really kick up a gear and become more of a mainstream thing than a marginal thing. Yeah. And so I think for a lot of countries in the US orbit, they're probably quite complacent about having that discussion, and there's a bit of procrastination going on there. People don't want to sort of break with a routine that they're comfortable with. They
Mm.
think that the fear of the unknown, the fear of shifting to some alternative sort of foreign policy arrangement is too unpredictable to consider going down. And there's some logic behind that. I think I understand why people feel that way, but at the same time, you can see that the blowback, yeah, is going to come. Yeah, the risks of being aligned with the US as it goes on this global campaign of geopolitical hostility towards country after country, and it tries, with all of its might, to hold on to that sort of privileged status that it enjoyed since the end of World War II, really. And it sort of ramps up a degree at the end of the Cold War with the collapse of the Soviets. That world, both the sort of Bretton Woods world of 1944-45, and the post-Cold War world of 1991 to, let's say, maybe about 5 years ago or so, that's pretty much over at this point. Yeah, the unipolar moment is sort of ending, and so for Australia and for other countries in the US camp, we do need to sort of, understand that mega trend that's not going away. Yeah. And so we have to sort of live in a world where we cooperate with our neighbors and we do have a more independent foreign policy. I think that's going to be key to our survival and to our prosperity in the 21st century. We can't necessarily go along with every US war. Yeah, we can't send troops to Iraq and to Afghanistan again, or all of the other countries where the US might.
Iran.
Sure. And you can sort of see that, if we do those things, there will be costs to us. Yeah, there will be sort of backlash from other countries that see us doing that and that don't like us doing that. Yeah, and so I think your point about our rhetoric in Southeast Asia and our actions in terms of cooperating with the US and its campaign to drum up war in the South China Sea, in particular. That's a very well made point. This is an untenable position in the long term. We can't continue sort of saying one thing and then doing another. And I think, yeah, if we think about like the AUKUS program, we're already sort of seeing the blowback from that choice to divert hundreds of billions of dollars of government revenue, yeah, away from things like science and education, and from public health care, and from all sorts of other things that we need to spend government money on. Yeah, that's going to generate lots of negative impacts on our society. It's going to generate lots of potential negative political backlash against the government going along with a program of increasing military spending, yeah, in order to sort of justify what the US is telling us we have to do. I mean, the NATO agreement with the US at the beginning of this year, where they more than doubled military spending from less than 2% of their GDP to 5% of GDP, is indicative of what the US is going to do to vassals in the next sort of several decades. They're going to try and um, bleed them in order to sort of pay for their own defense, and sort of pull back US troops from Europe and so on, pull back US troops from Asia, and have us turned into the Ukraine of Asia. Yeah, have us sort of do the heavy lifting of war with China. So you can sort of foresee in the next decade or two, if you just forecast out from those skirmishes between fishermen in the Philippines and those Coast Guard boats in the South China Sea from China, you could very quickly see how that could escalate into a hot war, yeah, between the Philippines and China. And the US would be very happy to sort of, just as they're doing with Ukraine at the moment, have the Philippines fight a war with China and not have the US directly involved, but arm the Philippines to the teeth, send lots of bombers over there, send lots of weapon systems, air defense systems, and so on, and create a much more chaotic and unstable geopolitical environment in Asia, and all the better for the US to be able to conquer it and be able to rule it. Yeah, because that would mean, instead of them cooperating with each other and being able to sort of freely trade with each other and have development and overcome, the neo-colonial sort of conditions in those countries like the Philippines. They're not going to be able to do that if they're at war. They're not going to be able to do that if they're being used in these sort of confrontations with countries like China.
Alex, like this Victoria Newland, like half-assed Ukraine scenario, the fact that it's like the model of choice now, it's kind of like, well, you're never going to defeat a real peer competitor running an operation like that. You can't defeat Russia. You're just going to kill a million more Ukrainians unless NATO goes in there, and millions of Europeans die in a massive continental war. And it's the same thing with Southeast Asia. I mean, to expect that Australia and the Philippines, I mean, look how reticent Korea and Japan are in their own national interests right now to be involved in these big programs. All of a sudden, it really does look like Australia and Philippines, dependent on if Marcos retains his leadership there. And that could quite easily go. I mean, Duterte was pointing towards Beijing much more than his successor. So, I mean, we are looking like Australia is the Ukraine, with half the population of Ukraine, with no contiguous land borders that we can sneak over and skirmish into. And all of a sudden, we're expected to be the base of operations for like some grand scale war against China, which they follow another model from World War II, a Douglas MacArthur kind of, muscle memory, where they're like, oh, we could just launch everything from Northern Australia at Asia again. It really feels like that we are stuck in this. We're one of the last nations stuck in that end of history mindset in the world. The whole world's embracing multipolarism, and we're one of the last core vassal states of the US that's completely aping in with everything here. So I do want to ask you, what opportunities do we miss out on here? I mean, like everyone talks about the risks, whether or whether or not it's best in our national interest. But what are the opportunities of changing the way we go about things, of maybe lessening our military, our rhetoric in Asia, and embracing this dynamic Asian century as a part of Asia? What are we missing out on?
So the US ASEAN trade relationship is by far the biggest volume trade relationship in the whole world. It's
Yeah.
bigger than China US trade. It's bigger than, say, I don't know, US EU trade. You might think those are the ones that are going to be the biggest, but no, it's China ASEAN trade. And that makes perfect sense given that, China's size and ASEAN's collective size of all those countries that make up the ASEAN group. And so, we're positioned kind of in a golden triangle there, yeah, next to two giant economic groups with, hundreds and hundreds of millions of consumers for goods that we could be exporting to them, services we could be exporting to them. Um, we are in such an amazing position, among countries of the world to benefit from that. We're extremely rich in raw materials. Yeah, there are things that we produce that are in demand from all those countries. Um, and our status quo right now is that China is our biggest customer. As they sort of continue with their green industrial revolution, something like 70% of the world's renewables installed in the last year was built in China alone. They've cornered the market on all sorts of aspects of the value chain in steel and the semiconductors and so on. There's so many opportunities, yeah, for Australia to sort of benefit from all of those things. If we are forced to sanction those countries and to, build walls, sort of blocking us off from ASEAN and from China and from any other country that is not aligned with what the with the geopolitical interests of the US, we're going to suffer. That's obvious. It's common sense that we're going to suffer. So, I would yeah, my hope would be that more people sort of wake up to that reality that we do need to cooperate and we do need to sort of work together, even if we disagree with other countries and we don't have their exact same worldview and we don't have their exact same political system and so on. It's still rational for us to try and have friendly relations with other countries. It's totally irrational for us to go down the path of confrontation and try and hold on to this dying sort of unipolar order. And so culturally, we're disinclined to do that because obviously we're so aligned with the US. We all watch Hollywood movies. We all listen to American pop music and so on. That's a global thing. But Australia in particular, as a country that's predominantly European descent, has a sort of affinity, I think, with the US, and therefore we're sort of we're inclined to sort of see our interests as being aligned with theirs in the same way that European settlers saw their interests as aligned with the British Empire, a century ago. But nevertheless,
Culturally pasteurized by the United States, eh?
Yeah, so this is kind of a choice that we do have before us, though. We've got two visions of Australia, right? So we can be an outpost of Europe or an outpost of America, or we can be comfortable with our geography and the reality of our position in Asia. We're an island off the coast of Asia. We're not in Europe. We shouldn't be in the Euro Song Contest and all those sorts of things. But culturally, we're sort of holding on to that. Yeah, we have this sort of legacy and this institutional memory that sort of binds us to this lost, golden age or whatever you want to call it. And this sort of animates a lot of our conservative political movements, of course. The desire to go back to that world of prosperity and so on in the 20th century.
I would argue it also convolutes our left movement as well here too. I mean, I think we're compartmentalized politically from Asia, full stop. I think even the way that the left embraces its politics is a very Western centric way of looking at the world as well. I mean, like a little bit of Confucianism, a little bit of Asian cultural kind of crossover here has been very handy for us in the past. And I mean, I suppose through the late 90s, as I was coming of age politically, and into the 2000s, there were some really direct government efforts, even bipartisan up to a certain point, that was really looking at that muscle memory of connecting to that system in Asia a little bit more, right? I mean, when all those Chinese universities started getting scrutinized, there was this, the golden age was, sorry, the Chinese cross cultural programs going on at universities were scrutinized. It felt like that party was over, and ever since we've really been just all in with Washington, right?
Yeah, I mean, so we do have a choice there, right? So we can go along with that and we can continue down that path of development, or we can pivot onto a new path and we can sort of think about, accepting our reality as a multicultural, uh, multi-ethnic, society in Asia, or we can sort of try and hold on to that sort of idea that we're a European outpost and we're going to go along with whatever the big European or American power says. Um, and where the costs of that sort of agenda. And so we're sort of seeing that with things like AUKUS. It's going to have blowback. It's going to have negative perceptions from our neighbors in our neighborhood, and it's our choice as a country. Whether we want to continue wearing that blowback and wearing those costs, or if we prefer not to. Yeah, and so this is the importance, I guess, of things like your podcast and the sort of media ecosystem in raising the consciousness around those ideas and opening up that discussion and hopefully getting people to see that the way the world is doesn't have to be you know how it is. There are other ways we could be doing things.
Yeah, look, that's a really good way of putting things, and I'm hoping lowly little bogan podcasts are enough to inform the mass numbers that are needed. But yeah, hopefully there'll be some people in Canberra that start speaking about these issues. I mean, we've got a few independents and a few on the crossbench that haven't really delved into our regional geopolitics yet. It would be very good to start having these discussions in Canberra, even if there was just one person willing to sort of, yeah, speak about what the potential of BRICS could be. I think if you put it on the table, just the average Australian punter can actually have a bit of a look at it and go, it's not so bad. Australians are, ignorant about Asia to an extent, but we're also quite familiar with it too. I mean, there's a lot of holidays, there's a lot of good Asian food on the menu on Australian dinner tables, and there seems to be a bit of a gravitational pull, regardless of what Washington or an ideological mindset in Canberra is doing, that is slowly, hopefully, pushing us closer towards integrating with this region as an Asian customer, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's slow burning sort of structural trends like the demographic sort of changes and cultural changes. Yeah, you could imagine that will have some impact. I wouldn't count on it being the decisive factor though
No.
to sort of get us to geopolitically realign. So I think it kind of has to be a political discussion, and it kind of has to be something where the nature of the state is contested by different social movements and different political forces, and the public debate about these ideas sort of has to be had. Yeah. So it's probably not going to be enough that we're all having Asian cuisine or something, and then
That's right. Uh, Hence the need for a couple of voices. And look, I've got to end this one with you. I know you've got things on, but your paper kind of ends with a bit of a structural pessimism about BRICS, I suppose, a caution about it. How can it become more than a talk shop? Essentially. And so 5 years from now, for example, where do you think BRICS is going to be? Where do you think Indonesia is going to be? And where is Australia going to be in your predictions within all of that development?
Yeah, it's very hard to predict, obviously, but if you forecast based on current trends and you sort of see the hostility towards BRICS expansion from the global north continuing, and you see, attempted regime change in lots of countries across the global south continuing, I think the incentives for cooperation among countries of the global south are going to be even greater than they are today. Yeah, and so the incentives are sort of set up for them to formalize the institutions around BRICS or the SCO or other sort of global South-South cooperation platforms. The ingredients are all there for them to continue doing what they have been doing and to sort of make them to turn them into more formal organizations rather than just forums where they discuss potential cooperation agreements. Um, and in order for them to have collective security and to avoid being picked off one by one, I think there's going to be a desire for speaking in a more coherent voice among these global south platforms, and that's a question of survival for countries like Iran and for Russia and so on. So
Could
the
this mean an Asian NATO, a military alliance that that
yeah,
accompanies the
okay.
economic one? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there are incentives there to sort of push it in that direction.
Yeah.
I think it wouldn't necessarily have to be a military pact, but I think if you look at the way particularly Iran and particularly Russia are perceiving the hostility with which BRICS expansion is happening, and the attempts to overthrow their governments and the attempts to sort of force them to do whatever the US wants, that that's not something you can sort of negotiate with. That's not something you can sort of like. I don't know how the US is expecting them to react, but like, of course, they're going to talk to each other and express their common grievances and try and overcome those through more cooperation. So that's kind of where I see things going in a general sense. Um, in terms of Australia, I think that's again, it's very unpredictable. But if you're forecasting based on current trends, um, I don't see AUKUS going away. I think in 5 years' time, I think we will have continued down that path of that policy and of increasing military spending. We will be diverting lots of money away from lots of needed things that the government should be spending money on in order to fund it. So fiscal austerity and the blowback from that, from social movements and from people who need support from the government, is going to ramp up. I think there'll be a lot more conflict in our society as a result of those sorts of things.
Mhm.
I think it becomes very unpredictable, but yeah, I think if you're forecasting based on current trends, those two dynamics are probably going to continue for at least the next 5 years or so. The tendency for BRICS to formalize itself and sort of shift away from being just a talking shop, a forum where they sort of have these summits and then nothing changes. Um, and the tendency for Australia to continue towing the US line in Asia, because again, for the sorts of reasons I was talking about before, we're disinclined to breaking with that tradition, and we're sort of again very culturally aligned with the United States, and it's very hard to break that. It's very hard to sort of see a way in which the majority of the population would not see ourselves as being having that deep cultural affinity with the US. And so I think that's a challenge for anyone who's trying to sort of flip the geopolitical alignment of Australia to a more independent foreign policy. And it's not to say that we should join BRICS, but like I think we should have an independent foreign policy. I think we should not be sort of getting dragged into these great power conflicts. And it would be better for us if we can stay neutral in those conflicts. Yeah, the countries that are going to prosper in the 21st century are going to do what Indonesia tried to do in the middle of the 20th century with the non-aligned movement, and to stay out of it. Yeah, to sort of try and row between two reefs is the phrase that their foreign minister Muhammad Hatta said at the time.
And they know how to think in those ways. I mean, we've got this Graham Allison Thucydides trap, like zero sum game, like imprinted on our brain. We're a big island continent nation at the bottom of the earth, and I think our story hasn't been told. And it's so good that there's people like you out there expressing a little bit of a different a different way forward. And yeah, hopefully we can get your voice out there a little bit more, Alex. And thank you very much for joining the program.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Joel.
Cheers.